about trickle down, whereas in theory if you give a lot of money to a few people at the top, eventually a lot of that will trickle down to people at the bottom. In actual fact, the way the model works best is trickle up. If you give people the money at the bottom, it gradually trickles up to the people at the top, because people at the bottom are going to spend more money if they've got the money, whereas people that have got a lot of money tend to save it or spend it on things, items which are either imported or don't have a big effect on your local economy. So that's quite an important point as well. In terms of the banks, forget the food banks, talk about the banks. The UK government got a total of 500 billion into the banks in 2008, which shows where the priorities were. So it was all about protecting bankers. And it was a mixture of loans, guarantees, equity, they bought some banks. But it's an important point as well that came up quite a lot in the referendum. The US government actually put more money into the UK banks than the UK government did. They put about $1 trillion, which just shows you how interconnected and globalised the World Bank system is. So moving back to austerity, there's a nice wee quote there, Nicola talking about this. Austerity's failed, you need an alternative that promotes growth and fairness. So again, it's those two parts to this. An economic model that makes sense, but also something that supports social cohesion. And the whole thing ties together, because I said, if you're putting the money into the hands of the people that need the money most, it's got a much more impact on economic growth than doing it the other way around. The economic proposal that's been talked about, which has been floated over the last few weeks, and this is kind of part of the SNP's bargaining kit, if you like, when they go to Westminster after the election. As I said at the beginning, we're in the UK, we're here. If we're going to be represented at Westminster, we've got as much right to put our point of view forward in terms of where we think UK economic policy should be going as anybody else does. And that's the headline of the proposal that's been talked about, which is round about a 0.5% increase in annual spending, which sounds a small number. That adds up to about 180 billion extra spending over the 5 years, which sounds like a big number. But if you actually look at what it means we're effectively, in real terms, taking investment back to where it was pre-crash. So that's all we're doing. The economic model actually says you're supposed to invest more. The Keynesian model, you're supposed to invest more when things are bad, and you can afford to invest less when things are good, because when things are good, the economy's ticking along quite nicely, thank you. It's when you hit the downturn, you need to get the thing kick-started with some extra investment. So those numbers of themselves aren't ridiculous numbers in any way, shape or form. So I'll show you the Scottish Government's record on investment. This is taken 2008 as the baseline. What's happened to the respective investment the Scottish Government spend compared to the UK Government. Both have come down, and the Scottish Government are a victim of the funding from Westminster because they're not allowed to borrow any money to invest, which is typically how you would do investment. But even in that sense, coming down a lot less fast than the extent to which the UK Government slashed UK-wide investment. So in terms of the Scottish Government, more investment, more employment, less unemployment. Scottish growth is actually slightly above the UK average over the last couple of years, and doing all of that while balancing the budget in the Scottish context, because I said they're not allowed to borrow money, the Scottish Government, and that's with the limited powers that are there, which kind of begs the question, if we had more powers, what else could we do? And a lot of that comes down to not just economic policy, but the inherent coherence of a country of 5 million people, and its ability to react quicker to downturns, take advantage of opportunities quicker, and have a more coherent society and a more coherent economy. And I'll talk a wee bit about some Scandinavian countries later and give examples of that. And you talk about the UK parties, I kind of lump them all together. The reality is that they're all much or muchness. If you look at the track record there, clearly the Liberals being in bed with the Tories, part of this austerity, cost-cutting exercise over the last 5 years, trying to backpedal from it politically as the election approaches, but I think the goose is well and truly cooked on that one. Labour Party, let's not forget, voted with the coalition for an extra 30 billion cuts just in the last month or so, and signed up to the Tory kind of framework around about economic plans for the next Parliament. Because they're victims of what you call triangulation, which is this horrible political work whereby they figure out where the centre ground is and they figure out where their opponents are, and they try to position themselves as close to their opponents as they can, but just on the side of where they think the centre ground is. So at a UK-wide level, there's no votes for Labour in being significantly further to the left, or significantly less in favour of austerity than the Tories are, because as long as they can kind of hold the Tories and be just one step away from them, they're going to pick up the centre ground, and that's been the whole philosophy from a political point of view. And it works great in the south of England and in the Midlands to some extent, where most of the votes are. But of course in Scotland, where there are alternatives, they've been caught short and found out for where they've positioned themselves politically. Something they didn't think would be a problem for them, but clearly in the political environment over the last few months, it's kind of a lot of these calculations have changed. So that kind of explains where the UK parties are, and more importantly, why they are where they are, and that's not going to change in a hurry. Okay, so you recognise this guy? This is the guy that turns up at your party with one kind of special brew. He wants to come in and drink all your finest malts, your classic cake crasher. So, and that's the kind of view that in certain quarters of what Scottish politicians go to Westminster is all about. But the reality is we contribute more than our fair share to the UK coffers in terms of income and in terms of exports, and we've got every right to play a full role in determining UK economic policy as an equal member of the family of nations in this United Kingdom of ours, as David Cameron put it. So we shouldn't feel bad about going down there and staking out what we think UK economic policy should be, and we shouldn't feel bad about making an influence on the British UK government to drag them in a direction that makes sense for Scotland and for the UK as a whole. Scotland's GDP, gross domestic product, it varies year to year, but on average about 15% higher than the UK average. That's the amount of economic activity within Scotland. Scotland's GDP per person, excluding oil, is about the same as the UK average. So when we talk about oil, it's very much the bonus. It's something we've got that we can use to invest for the future. It's not an essential part of our economy, and what it does do is it lifts Scotland in terms of the economic activity, GDP, higher up the league table than the UK average. Higher tax revenue per person than the UK average, and I'll show you the graphs in a minute. And also a positive balance of payments. Balance of payments, the difference between what you import and what you export, which I'm going to talk about as well. Scotland contributes more than 40 billion to UK exports per year. 28 billion of that, interestingly, is from non-oil sectors, food and drink, chemicals, petrochemicals, manufactured items to some extent, and a whole range of other sectors I'm going to talk about later. I'm going to quickly whiz through some stuff just to show Scotland's economic strength vis-a-vis the rest of the UK. This is a graph that shows tax revenue per person over the last 30 years since they started collecting data. Scotland's numbers are the higher line, and the UK's numbers are the average is the lower line, the lower bar. Every one of the last 34 years now, Scotland has generated more tax per person. That's the combined income tax, corporation tax, VAT, all added together per head of population than the UK average. Offshore clearly is a part of that, but as I said, that's very much the bonus. Even without that, we've got a strong economy. But in terms of the amount we put into the UK, it's significant, and as I say, it's more per person than the UK average. That's the map. If you haven't seen these before, it's worth just going through them. That's the map of GDP per part of the UK. The darker the colour, the more economic activity, the more wealth is generated in that part of the UK. As you'd expect, in the south of England, quite a lot of economic strength, a lot of rich areas generating the economic activity. A wee bit around about the Manchester area in the northwest. Northeast of Scotland, clearly one of the areas of highest economic activity, and across the central belt as well of Scotland, significant. So that's the parts of the UK that generate the wealth, if you like, for the country. That's the UK Office of National Statistics graph map of where the richest households in the UK are. The darker the colour, the higher percentage of rich households. South of England, more than 13% are classed as being what they call rich households, which their definition is a household that's got assets of more than £1 million, including your house, your shares, your cars, your yacht, and whatever added together. So in the south of England, that's more than 13%, and in Scotland it's less than 7% households are in that category. So that kind of shows you the reality between Scotland's income generation and the amount that comes back to Scotland through whatever public public sector spending or other mechanisms. And just to touch on this one, because we talked about the economy and we talked about the social impact of that. This is a map of average male life expectancy at birth across the UK. The darker the colour, the lower the life expectancy. And there's actually some areas of dark green in there that you can't see because they're so small, which have got the highest life expectancy in the UK, which is Chelsea, Kensington and Westminster. So no surprise there. So the whole point being there's a very close, it's not just about the money, there's a very close correlation between health outcomes and wealth, which is kind of starkly shown there. So, right, moving on. The broad shoulders, as was talked about, the broad shoulders of the UK that we can all rely on to look after us. We've looked at debt and deficit, and the UK is not wonderful position there. This is a balance of payments, which is what I kind of touched on earlier. The UK balance of payments, difference between our imports and our exports. The UK as a country imports significantly more than it exports, and has done for a very long time. And I remember back 30 years ago, we talked about the balance of payments was a big deal. With a negative balance of payments, people used to get worried about it. We stopped worrying about it somewhere about 20 years ago, and nobody really talks about it very much now. But basically, it's an important indicator of how well you're trading in the world. And the only thing that keeps the UK balance of payments kind of from being completely through the floor is Scottish exports and the City of London financial sector, which has got a lot of cash kind of running through it. And if you think about it, it's a sector that relies on, what does it rely on? I'm not quite sure. It's kind of folk trading in the City of London that have got other people's money that they're kind of dealing in. So that's a big part of the positive side of that. And in terms of the real economy, a big part of it is Scottish exports. So that's not great. There's some graphs of other countries' balance of payments. I was picked at random. Denmark, Germany, Sweden, they're all kind of clustered there, about the plus 5% number. And the one at the top is Norway. There's no surprise there. So compared to some countries in Europe, our comparable countries, the UK balance of payments is not very clever. So when we talk about broad shoulders, both in terms of balance of payments in the UK and in terms of the debt and the deficit, being big doesn't mean that you're necessarily healthy. And I put this one in because it's close to my heart, it's deindustrialisation. It's a percentage of the economy and manufacturing over the last 40 years. So back to 1970, a whole cluster of European countries had manufacturing sectors, 25 to 30% of their total economy. Some of us can remember some of that. The line that goes right to the floor, 10% or less is the UK. So we've deindustrialised at a faster rate than most other European countries. All that goes to show that the UK isn't as strong as they would have you believe. So in summary, the austerity model is broken. It doesn't work. It doesn't mean from an economic point of view. The economic theory says it shouldn't work. The data shows you that it doesn't work, and the social consequences of it are not very clever either. The UK is not in a great place when it comes to a number of key economic indicators. The UK economy is unbalanced, and you look at the destruction of that manufacturing sector kind of emphasises that, and it's unfair. But there are alternatives there that can work, and bizarrely it's Scotland that's kind of showing the rest of the UK the way on how that different economic policy could be coherently implemented. So we talk about the politics of this, what's going to happen? Well, there's two parts to this. There's a part, the away leg, if you like, what happens at Westminster, which is all about two things. It's about bringing home Smith, plus a lot more than that, hopefully, giving the Scottish Government the powers to do more of the economic activity that we think we need to do, but also recognising the fact that there was a no vote, we are part of the UK for the foreseeable future, and that means we've got an influence on what happens in the UK. So the second part of what we need to do is to direct the UK government policy away from failed austerity and towards something that makes more sense, not just for Scotland, but for the UK as a whole. And the second part then, of course, is the home leg, what happens in Holyrood going forward over the next number of years. That's about taking those new powers that come back here and implementing them in a clever, coherent way that makes a difference to people's lives and gets the economy moving again in Scotland. Creating confidence that as a nation we're able to deal with those extra powers as we get more and more of the economic tools, and building infrastructure in the country, because there's a lot of things frankly we can